Hey sword friends, I've had a lot of questions lately about what is the difference between a tachi and a katana. Let's go over some of the history and find out where these two kind of fit into the history of these nihonto. Let's take a closer look. Now before we take a look at these swords here I have on display today, we have to go back even earlier. Before the 10th century, you had mainly what were called ken. Ken means sword, or tsurugi. These are two-sided edged weapons. After the 10th centuries, these kind of chokuto means a straight blade, they disappeared, not exclusively, but mostly. And they came to be as ceremonial swords, which were offered more for Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. So you have these really old style swords coming from China that developed into the more curved sword that we know today as the katana. I'll repeat this again and again, as with all things samurai, these things evolved over decades, if not centuries. So it's not something that just happens immediately. It all depends on the type of warfare. Are you on a horse? Are you at sea? Are you fighting on foot? What are you fighting? Who are you fighting? Are you fighting the Mongols, the Chinese? All these things depend and evolve over time. So nothing is set in stone, and many of these swords overlap and almost have the same name. The first thing to know with any historical video like this is I'm not a historical expert. I am a martial artist, a school owner, a longtime kenjutsu practitioner, and I teach. But I always make mistakes with these because there's so many things to memorize. I can't possibly keep all that knowledge in my head. A few things that I know from all of my sensei is that this, which is called a yari, a spear, was a primary weapon on the Japanese battlefield. Swords are considered tertiary or secondary weapons. They're way down the chain. You had a spear like this. If you had that coming at you on the battlefield, you would be in big trouble, because these things could be anywhere from 4 feet to like 10, 12, 15 feet long, with a nasty two-sided blade on here designed to stab and pierce through the enemy lines into your body. So a spear was considered superior to the sword, of course, because of its length. Aside from the spear, another weapon that was used far more than any other was the yumi and the ya, the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow archery took so many lives, as well as the teppo, the tanagashima, the rifles that came into being, the guns took many lives. But dispersed throughout all of that, you had these swords. An old sword, this is called a tachi, T-A-C-H-I. Tachi were the mainstream Japanese swords of the Koto period, which was 900 to 1596. Even after the Muromachi period, which was like the 1300s to the 1500s, when katana became the mainstream, these were still worn by high-ranking samurai. So this is an actual tachi. As you can see, it's blinged up big time. It's just full of decoration here. And each of these sword iterations, again, had a purpose on the battlefield. So if I was, on a sword, if I was the cavalry, I would want this suspended from my belt here. So the blade is worn down with the tachi, blade down. It's very, very deeply curved, unlike the katana. This is probably more deeply curved. It's longer, typically the sori, so that you could slash opponents from above them. I would draw this out one-handed here, not hitting the horse in the head or the mane, and I would slash down at the opponent because a long curve makes a really nice cleaving action. So that was the tachi. It had all of this extra ashi furniture on here. It had all this beautiful metalwork, which again would keep the saya maintained in contact. So if I had a simple wood saya like this, you can see there's nothing on it, no adornment. That would shatter on the battlefield within seconds. You needed this bolster here. Of course, you could hit with that. You had all this wrapping here to wrap around your obi belt. You had this extra ito here so that the sword wouldn't be scratching up your armor and stuff. You had all these adornments on here so you could hang it. You had the very fancy tsuba. The blades were often heftier, maybe even wider or longer, depending on the smith. These were probably manufactured quite quickly to get them out in the battlefield, but these lasted for a long, long time. One way to tell The tachi is the signature, the mei. The signature will always be on the omote side, which is the outside of the sword, the side facing out from your hip. So if I had this on my left hip, the omote side is out, and the ura side is toward me. So the signature on a tachi with the blade down is out here. This is where the signature will be. It won't be on this side. On the katana, it's the opposite, and I'll get to that in a few moments. But one of the ways to tell the difference is where the signature of the blade is. The omote part of the sword here often had more bling on it, and it was designed to impress the opponent. You would have all these different decorations on here. You can see here there's carved etchings in here. It's really beautiful. And often the tsuba guard would be more decorative facing the opponent, and it might be more simple on this side. So here's one tachi. Here's another. Bit of a different style. You can see the ashi here, all the different adornments. I'll draw this out for you. I'm going to lay this right here. So here's a huge tachi blade, very curved, very long, very heavy. And these were used for many, many centuries. Now, there was a time in the Mongol invasions of Japan in the 13th century. This is where the Mongols had a technically superior force, without a doubt. They laughed at the Japanese bows because the Mongols had better bows. The armor was better quality. Not only did they have access to better steel, and they used steel in their armor, unlike the Japanese at that time. Even their leather armor was no joke. Contemporary accounts spoke of the Japanese tachi getting caught and snapping when used against the Mongol leather armor. So this was one of the events that heavily influenced the need for Japan to develop better metalworking. Not that these swords were anything to laugh at, but as you can see, depending on the battles and who you're fighting, your enemies, the swords had to evolve. They had to change depending on what the commanders wanted to win. Now, before we get to the katana here, I want to talk about this sword. This is called a handachi. This is kind of a transition. The handachi, han means half, and there's that word dachi or tachi. This, in later Japanese feudal history, during the Sengoku and the Edo period, certain high-ranking warriors of the ruling class wore their sword tachi style, edge down. This is a transitional sword, and it has the fittings on here of an old-style tachi, but now they've taken off all this stuff, the ashi here, all this, and they put on a simple kurigata with a sageo on there. Now you have a sword that looks like halfway between this and that, hence the name handachi. Sometimes they would wear this with the sword up, and sometimes with the blade down. It just depended on what they were doing, were they at court or not, what period of history was it, but the metal working on here is a bit less blingy. This is a giant sword here. This one happens to be made of S5 shock steel, but it's very long, very curved, and very, very powerful. And these could have been worn by high-ranking warriors later in history. Now, after the tachi weren't used as much, people were getting off their horses. What they tended to do was they would cut the tang. They would cut the root and shorten it. And the blade would have been converted into what we call an uchigatana. Uchigatana means striking sword, and this is what the Japanese would call the swords in the older days. Think of uchigatana as just an older word for katana. Katana is what the name kind of ended up with, meaning any type of long sword. The uchigatana has a curved blade. I'm just going to use this one here, which is longer than 24 inches, more than 2 shaku. There's no upper length limit to how long the sword could be. It could be 35 inches or more. This would be worn with the edge upward in the sash. And it was developed from a sasuga, a kind of tanto around the 14th century. This became the mainstream, replacing the tachi from the 15th century onwards. Now the katana and the uchigatana, again, as I said, are just different names, a little bit different the way that they're made. The uchigatana would have been used by infantry. They were more mass-produced. They tended to be of poorer quality, and they might even be disposed of after battle. You can imagine these being produced quicker in weeks instead of months. They break more easily. They're just kind of a utilitarian sword, hence the name uchigatana. You're going to smash the opponent with his armor, and you're going to get rid of the sword after. All of the ashi straps, all of the bolstering metal saya rings and fittings eventually removed, making a less curved, shorter, more simple design, the uchigatana. Now again, we're talking over a period of decades or even centuries that this all changed. And of course you still had the wakizashi, the side sword here, which was the sidearm for many, many years worn on the armor, along with the long sword. And you had tanto, which sometimes were carried in the older days, a utilitarian knife here to remove heads and top knots and things like that. The tanto was often a finishing weapon on the battlefield if you got really close. So these two swords we're not going to talk about today, but they're dispersed throughout history as we'll call it a third sword on the body. So over a period of several hundred years, you had your cavalry with the tachi as their secondary weapons. Of course, they had the bow and arrow, which took the most lives. You had tanagashima and teppo guns later on. You had your spear. You had naginata on the battlefield. Eventually, you still had horseback people, cavalry, but you also had what's called ashigaru, these foot soldiers, because you had hundreds and hundreds of men recruited to fight for your country. And they would have like this, which is a nagamaki, which is a giant sword here, just massive, huge battle sword with an extremely long handle for leverage, again, to be able to cut the legs of horses, to reach the opponent through the spear line, and to cut the opponent perhaps off of a horse. A massive, massive sword that they would give to the warriors who were walking on foot. They would just give them one of these and say, "Go forth, my child, and hack what's in front of you." Just a very hefty, giant sword. And there were other swords in the same time period and overlapping called field swords, or odachi. O is great. Great dachi, great tachi. You see how the T changes to a D here. O dachi, a great tachi. Or sometimes called no dachi, a field sword. This sucker was super thick. Often the naginata blade would be cut down, the tang would be cut, and they would be made into swords. So you basically have a massive naginata here. Just look at the beef and the width of that sword. It's very thin, but it's going to cut through limbs like butter, in a very, again, long handle like this one to be able to have leverage. And with your armor on, you couldn't see peripherally very well, but you could go forward with that and do a lot of damage. So there's no dachi or odachi, almost the same thing, came at a period in history when you were on foot for a lot of your battles. Nowadays, all these kind of melted into what we call the katana, or katana, depending on where you live, which we see in movies and anime and manga. This is what we see in the movies, the katana. This is a very famous sword, and it basically represents almost any sword from Japan. A sword in Japan, made in Japan, is called a nihonto. We just say katana to represent anything in the nihonto family of swords. The blade length, the nagasa on these are usually more than 2 shaku. Approximately 60 centimeters or 24 inches or longer is considered a katana. Below that's considered a shoto. So here's a typical everyday katana. It's very sharp, very nice. This is what we associate with swords from Japan nowadays, and this is the word that I use. I don't use uchikatana anymore. And again, remembering that the bow, the spear were superior over this. This is a secondary weapon. This is what you wore here on your belt with the blade up, and you would use this as a last resort. If you had a spear or a naginata or a bow, pick that first. This would be second. So now we have a wider look at these battlefield weapons. Someday, very soon, I'm going to go over another video where I explain all the different weapons, but that's going to take like an hour. This is a short video on the difference between the cavalry sword and the walking sword, or the ashigaru. So we have a cavalry sword, you have your field swords, you have your later in period handachi, you have the uchikatana or katana, the wakizashi, the shoto, the tanto here. In my book, all of these are damn cool, and that's why I collect them. I absolutely love them, but not to look at them. I like to use them. I like to feel the difference between this one and that one, the weight, the length of the blade. Your taijutsu has to change. You have one of these, it's twice the weight as the others. It's bulky. You're going to draw it out differently. You're going to do noto differently. And then, of course, you have your giant spear, which is a whole other way to use your feet and distancing when fighting on the battlefield. So many cool weapons here. Don't you just love looking at this stuff like I do? I just can't get enough of it. I wake up in the morning excited to talk about this. Of course I'm going to make mistakes about all the details. I'm not a historian. I am a lover of swords as you are. What do you think, my friends? Aren't these kind of off the scale in the cool factor? You're a geek, I'm a geek. Let's embrace that. I love swords. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Be safe. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.